Bee abundance was generally the highest initially in that short-term window after disturbance, that 2 to 5 year period. And that was true for both of our disturbances, where a key piece here was that bee abundance initially was actually much higher in the clear cuts than in the burns. But then by the time we got to the oldest stand, so 16 to 20 years after disturbance, bee abundance had really dropped off in the clear cuts, but remained relatively high post-fire.
From the Oregon State University Extension Service, this is PolliNation, a podcast that tells the stories of researchers, land managers, and people like you who are making bold strides to improve the health of pollinators. I'm your host, Dr. Adoni Malathopoulos, Associate Professor of Pollinator Health in the Department of Horticulture. There are all kinds of disturbances in forests. You can think about wildfires, timber harvesting, landslides. But are all these disturbances equal when it comes to ecological systems? Many of you have seen these disturbances and they quickly fill up with wildflowers, and the wildflowers give way to shrubs, and then the trees grow. But is this successional process the same from the perspective of bees? Well, my guest is an expert at this. Dr. Graham Frank has recently gotten his PhD on this very subject from Oregon State University in the Forests and Ecosystems and Society program. Dr. Frank recently had a paper published out of his dissertation titled Comparison of Early Seral Forest Bee Communities Following Clearcutting or Wildfire Depends on Stand Age and Nesting Guild. This was published in the Journal of Forestry recently, and I had an opportunity to talk with Dr. Frank about this paper. It's a really interesting ecological study with thousands of bees collected and some very surprising results. So without further ado, let's head into the forest with Dr. Graham Frank this week on PolliNation. Well, I'm really excited to have you on the show this week, Dr. Frank.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Andoni.
So you have a new paper that is published, and it has to do with bees and forests. And I guess maybe to start things off, a lot of people probably don't think about bees and forests. You know, when we're hiking through the Cascades, we're in this Douglas fir stand, and it's relatively dark, and we think about these open meadows when we maybe get to higher elevation. But I suppose, you know, when I think about it, forests are naturally disturbed. You have a forest fire, and, you know, that opens up some area for plants to grow. That bees may visit. But we also disturb forests through things like timber management. Do you just help us understand, should we expect that these disturbances to be similar, these sort of, you know, human induced management disturbances and sort of these natural disturbances like forest fires?
Yeah, so that was really the big question that we were trying to get at, right? Is how similar are the kind of main way that we harvest timber, this sort of intensive management process that's used on a lot of private lands in the Northwest, how similar is that to wildfire, which is a natural disturbance, even if, you know, wildfires are kind of increasing in severity and scale in the Northwest, it still is a disturbance that forests around this region are adapted to, and the species in this region have sort of adapted to the habitat it creates over time. And so we can kind of use wildfire as this natural reference condition in some ways. And so at really broad strokes, right, you'd kind of expect, well, they're both removing the forest canopy, allowing a lot of light to reach the understory. That's probably going to allow a lot of flowers to not only, you know, flowering plants to grow, but also provide the energy that those plants need to flower, which is, of course, important for pollinators. But once we get past that really sort of superficial similarity, we'd expect quite a few differences, right? For one, wildfire produces a big pulse of dead wood to the system. It can also attract a lot of wood-boring beetles that create holes in that dead wood, which is an important nesting substrate for some bees. Creates a lot of bare ground, whereas, you know, a timber harvest certainly creates some bare soil, but also leaves some of that litter layer in place. And then there's also the post-disturbance management. So we looked at wildfires that had been managed very little after disturbance, right? Because that's sort of our control condition. In some cases, they were planted a bit, but the timber harvests that we looked at were managed with herbicides to remove or reduce the competition with planted conifer trees. So
Mhm.
these were planted with mostly Douglas fir, and then herbicides were used to allow those trees to grow quickly. And so there are also things you'd expect from that herbicide treatment in particular, right? Like a limiting of the kind of shrub layer, maybe a change in the vegetation community overall. And we might expect that to influence the bee community.
No, that's fascinating. I can imagine this when a fire goes through, there is going to be this debris, and even though there's debris after forest management, it's a different type of debris. Like the dent, I imagine the chunkiness of lack of a better term, but the the type and character of that debris is going to be way different.
Sure, there's certainly like a size element to it, but there's and an arrangement piece too, like wildfires leaving standing snags, whereas, after timber harvest, the dead wood that's left is usually left on the forest floor. And there's also just a lot less of it, right? Because most of the valuable wood is being removed for creating wood products.
Well, let's come back to sort of how you expect these different systems to, maybe impact a bee community. But how can you do this? Like, how can one compare these different things? I imagine a forest fire happens way over here, and then a timber harvest, takes place, and they're not the same age, and so there's all these confounding variables. How were you able to do a study that could compare these different disturbances and not only compare these disturbances at one point, but I imagine the biological impacts on the bee community are maybe, 4 years down the road. How did you even come up with the design to do this kind of comparison?
Yeah, so Southwest Oregon is somewhat unique in the way that it allowed us to do this study. As your listeners might be aware, there's been a lot more wildfire in the Pacific Northwest in recent decades than we've seen, at least in the kind of 20th century, and particularly in Southwest Oregon. When it comes to Western Oregon, Southwest Oregon is a lot drier and therefore a lot more fire prone than the rest of the western part of the state. And so there've been all of these wildfires down there. People might remember the Biscuit Fire in 2002 that was breaking records at the time for size. And so that was kind of the oldest fire that we worked off of. But then we also had other fires in, from 2013, 2015, 2017, and 2018. And so by having this kind of series of wildfires, we were able to get a variety of time since disturbance.
Ah,
And Southwest Oregon, there are plenty of wildfire prone landscapes across the Western US, but Southwest Oregon also has this large managed forest land base, right? So there's a lot of large companies managing private land for timber down there as well. So there's this intersection of these two disturbances going on in really close proximity in a way that allowed us to try to control for some of the things like forest type. So we limited our study to just be in forest types that mapped out to Douglas fir or Douglas fir tan oak forest types. And then we also tried to match up things like elevation and aspect as much as possible so that we at least had similar ranges between our different disturbances and our different age classes. So not only were we comparing timber harvest in an intensively managed context to wildfire with very little post-fire management, but we also looked at three different age classes. And when I say age, I mean time since disturbance, really. So we had a young age class that was 2 to 5 years after disturbance, sort of an intermediate age class that was 6 to 9 years after disturbance, and then an older one that was 16 to 20 years after disturbance. You'll notice a bit of a gap in there between the intermediate and the old, and that's sort of one of the small limitations with a study like this is, there wasn't as much wildfire between in kind of the early aughts, I should say. And so we weren't able to get that kind of, 10 to 15 year period post disturbance, but we nonetheless were able to cover most of what I would think of as the early Seral period of forest development, basically that time between the stand replacing disturbance and up until canopy closure.
Oh, that's amazing. Okay, so you've got this nice kind of pairing of these two disturbances, the forest fire and sort of clear cut harvesting. And then you've got this nice overlay where you have plots that are of different ages that have the same disturbance. So you can kind of forecast out or predict sort of how that community would change over time.
Yeah, exactly. And that change over time is such an important part of this study, I think, because this early serial period does change so much in a short time. Like people, I think often it's easy to think of a forest as a really static environment, especially when you're in an older forest that's more mature. It's like, you know, been growing, some of those trees have been around for hundreds of years. But in an early cereal forest, that vegetation, just the height of that vegetation might be doubling year over year in some cases. And so that's going to result in really distinct changes to the bee community in a really short time period. I
I
should
did.
say before
Oh, yeah.
one other thing about the study design, we also had another category that was salvage logging.
That's what I was going to ask you about.
Yeah.
Just in one group, at one age category.
Yeah, so a little imperfect there, but we were hoping to have this really nice, three age categories and three disturbances. But when I first started this study back in 2018, actually, we were out looking for field sites, and there were fires ongoing in Southwest Oregon. The Klondike fire was one of those, and it burned through part of the Biscuit fire, which had happened in 2002, which was our oldest
Oh.
area. And so we lost a lot of stands that would have been suitable for like that older age category of salvage logging. And then there was also some salvage logging we kind of expected to happen from more recent fires that basically nobody bid on. And so there were no timber operators who wanted to harvest the wood from those stands. And so they ended up not being salvaged and we didn't have sampling opportunities there. So we still looked at salvage logging. We still thought it was important, in particular because there's been some other studies on salvage logging and bees in that part of the state in Southwest Oregon. So we were kind of following up on that, but we weren't able to look at it across that whole age gradient.
And let me just think about this for a second. So salvage logging, so if we have this, it's almost an intermediate between the two in that some of that woody material that would have been left after a fire is now being picked up and taken off. So you have almost this strange hybrid between the two treatments.
Yeah, in some ways it's a bit of both, right? You've got the fire and the timber harvest where that dead wood's being removed after fire. And in some ways it's totally its own thing, right? You've unlike a regular timber harvest where they're removing green trees, salvage harvest is occurring in this post-fire context and so it can have some kind of unforeseen effects sometimes.
All right. Well, let's come back to we were talking just a minute ago about sort of we have these different disturbances and how it may affect the bee communities. I mean, just circling back around, what did you expect? You've got these different disturbances and you kind of were walking through these plots and you had a sense of it. What were you expecting to see with the bee community? And why doesn't the bee community just change en masse? Like, you know, why is it important to look at this as a bee community rather than, one bee or some bumblebee of some sort?
Yeah, so there are a few ways to answer that. The comparison itself was a little hard to know exactly what to expect. And I think that's why it was helpful to, one thing we did with this analysis was to hone in on different sort of life history traits of the bees, right? It's kind of an easy way to categorize them. It's really hard. We had over 100 different bee species that we were looking at. And, it's really hard to make sense out of anything if you're trying to look at each of those species as individual. And so what we did is split them into really four categories based on whether they're social or solitary bees. So social bees, being your bumblebees are kind of probably the best example, honeybees, that kind of thing. And then solitary bees, I think mason bees are a good example where you've got a single female that's provisioning the nest on her own. And then we also split them up by whether they nest above ground or below ground. And we thought that would be important, mainly because there are some very different nesting substrates available. As I kind of alluded to earlier, right? Post fire, you have all this dead wood, and that's what a lot of bees that nest above ground nest in.
Mm.
And then we might expect sort of a difference in, I guess, resilience to disturbance for ground nesting bees and how they sort of respond over time to disturbance. So split them up into those categories. In terms of what we expected for just overall bee abundance and diversity, Rachel Zittimer, who is a PhD student at Oregon State, did a great study in the Oregon Coast Range where she looked at sort of just the time since disturbance in Clearcut's part of this study, sort of an analog to what we've done. And she showed a really clear pattern where, after harvest over time, the abundance and diversity are initially really high and then just kind of drop off. And so that's what we expected to see after the clear cuts over time, but we weren't quite as sure with wildfire. There was some research out of Japan about a decade ago that didn't look at wildfire, but they did look at harvested stands that were allowed to regenerate naturally. So they weren't planted, they weren't managed with herbicides. And what they saw is that the bee abundance and diversity remained elevated after disturbance for longer. And so one thing we kind of expected is that we might have sort of a longer period of relatively high bee abundance and diversity after fire. That said, I really didn't know, which one would support a higher diversity of bees in general, which would support more bees in general, that sort of thing. I did expect that those bees that nest in dead wood might do better after fire, but it was a little harder to make predictions for the rest of the community.
Okay, let's come back around this after we hear about your results, because then maybe the pieces will come together. But tell us a little bit about your method. So you have these, you told us a little bit about the sites, but
Mhm.
what were you measuring to look for these differences in the bee community?
Yeah, so we used blue vein traps, which your listeners might be familiar with, they might not be, but they're these passive traps. So instead of hand netting, we're out there just putting these, they've got kind of a yellow collection bottle and then a blue piece of plastic basically on top of that bottle that is very attractive to bees. And so we're putting that on a T-post that's in three different locations in each one of these forest stands. And we're leaving those up for 2 days in kind of late spring, and then again for 2 days in midsummer. So kind of the May, June time initially, and then sort of July, August later. And, it would have been great to go like 4 or 5 times during the season, but we were also doing this in conjunction with point counts for birds and pitfall traps for ground beetles and like all of these other things that we're trying to do to get a sense for biodiversity more broadly. We also then, each time we had those traps out, we were looking at flowers. So we would have all of these plots on, the forest floor and look at all the different flowering species. And that would get us a sense of the abundance of flowers overall and also how many different species of flowers we had when we were sampling. Other pieces we measured in terms of habitat were, vegetation height and overall cover of vegetation, and then dead wood. So we ran these transects where we measured the diameter of each piece of dead wood. Uh,
Wow.
yeah, measured the diameter of standing snags. Trying to remember what else. Yeah, a lot of pieces there where it comes to habitat characteristics.
Oh, so that's great. So you have this little, I guess I almost think it's like a little bee counter, just a little trail cam for bees. I guess the bee hits the vein and then you collect it. So you're getting this kind of constant signal of the bees that are in that unit versus another. But then you've got all these other things that might help explain the differences, like the wood diameter and the amount of it and the what the vegetation actually is like that can give insights as to, why you're seeing those differences.
Yeah, exactly. So the comparing the bees themselves, like that's our main objective here. But it's always nice to be able to say, well, maybe here is why this is happening, It's kind of unsatisfying just to say, yeah, we saw a difference.
Okay, well, tell us what you found. What was some of the big findings that, and I was really impressed when I was reading the paper. There's just It's a lot of material that you collected. It's a really rigorous bee survey. But what did you end up pulling out of the study?
Yeah, it was a lot of bees, and I should maybe give a shout out here to Link Best, who your listeners are probably familiar with, who identified all of those bees for us and is an author on the paper as well. But our main findings sort of aligned with some of the hypotheses I explained earlier. One of those is that bee abundance was generally the highest initially in that short-term window after disturbance, that 2 to 5 year period. And that was true for both of our disturbances, where a key piece here was that bee abundance initially was actually much higher in the clear cuts than in the burns,
Oh,
but which was kind of a little surprising to me. But then by the time we got to the oldest stand, so 16 to 20 years after disturbance, bee abundance had really dropped off in the clear cuts, but remained relatively high post-fire.
oh,
So
like the Japanese study that you were talking about earlier. These older stands post burn seem to sort of retain that diversity longer.
exactly, yeah.
Huh.
And right, and that was true for abundance and for diversity, or we actually looked at species richness, so the number of species. And so right, it looked like in our data, 16 to 20 years, we're basically getting in those clear cuts down to almost no bees. But it would have been really cool if we could keep sampling, what does it look like 30, 40, 50 years after fire for bees? Because we really didn't see a huge decline.
Can you just, to help me, what did those
Mhm.
older stands look like? Like, what are we talking about? Are we talking about trees up to your head or?
Yeah, well, really different from the clear cuts, mostly because they were really dominated by broadleaf tree species or
Oh,
shrubs or a
okay.
mix of those. And the broadleaf species down there are things like tan oak or canyon live oak, Pacific madrone, right? You've got this, it's a really, I think for people from Corvallis, it's going to look really different in a lot of ways than the forest you're used to up here, even though as you're going south, it changes kind of gradually. By the time you get down there in some of these burn stands, suddenly you're like, "Well, I don't even, what are all these broadleaf trees? Am I still in Oregon?" Yeah, so really often quite dense with broadleaf vegetation, kind of shrubby, like it's resprouted a lot of it
Uh-huh.
after fire, and so it's grown actually quite quickly in some cases, and really hairy stuff to work in, I will say. Yeah.
Those manzanitas can eat your ankles.
Yeah, yeah, I should, yeah, a lot of manzanita, a lot of ceanothus as well. Yeah.
Okay, that paints a picture. And on the managed force at this, the ones that had been, yeah, the managed force, what did they look like at the oldest age category? How big are the trees at that point?
Yeah, by that point, most of the trees are kind of like a large sapling size, I guess. Let's see. I actually have the paper. We took tree heights, and I'm just gonna scroll to find so I can give you a height number.
Okay.
I think. Let's see.
Large sapling. I'm imagining it's not that you could walk through it and it's you're they're still underneath you.
So not necessarily. It's more like I can't find the number right now, but I should say like these trees are maybe like 5 meters tall at least,
Oh, okay.
probably taller in some
Wow.
cases. So
All right.
so they're getting pretty large. In a lot of cases, the branches are starting to overlap a little bit from one tree to the next. So we're getting really up to canopy closure. And in those cases, like it was really important to wear eye protection because those little needles are right at eye level a lot of the time, and the branches are like right into your
This
face.
sounds like a perilous PhD.
It certainly was, yeah.
Okay,
Yeah, and we
so
had a lot of great field technicians who worked really hard for us. Yeah.
we had this, this expected or slightly unexpected. The diversity was highest in the early age categories, but it kind of retains in the burn site, the burn disturbance, it kind of
Mhm.
stays around, and I can almost picture why you've got all of these flowering shrubs around. But you also talked about these different life history traits. You have these
Mhm.
above ground nesting bees, below ground. Did they just uniformly follow this pattern, or were there kind of distinctions between them?
Yeah, so I talked a little bit about that solitary above ground nesting group of bees, and they were the group that separated from the rest. Most of the bees in our sample were ground nesting species, kind of a mix of social and solitary species. But this group of solitary above ground nesting species, right, mostly cavity nesters, they were they showed a really distinct response where the the ground nesting species basically, they drove that overall abundance response that I was talking about, where the abundance initially is higher in the clear cuts and then kind of drops off as we get really late in the early Seral period up to canopy closure, so that post-fire abundance is higher by the end. Right? That's what we saw with the below ground nesting species. But the solitary above ground nesting group, their abundance was higher post-fire across all of our stand ages in as compared to the clear cuts. That was kind of a weak effect initially, and by the end of the early Seral period, it was really quite strong. So, and we also showed that the abundance of that group was quite strongly correlated with the amount of dead wood,
Huh.
especially down to dead wood, so that kind of more decayed component.
Down dead wood. So we're talking rather than a snag, we're talking about, I imagine, a branch that fell and burnt, kind of like smaller diameter.
Yeah, so not necessarily smaller diameter. A lot of cases in these forests, 20 years is a pretty long amount of time for a snag. Really depending on the species of tree and the size of tree, you get a lot of those standing snags fracturing and falling to the ground by by
Okay.
20 years. And so a lot of that woody material had come down.
Okay. And so I can this let me see if this makes sense. In my mind, I can almost piece this picture together. Maybe it's a just so story, but you've got down dead wood that these above ground bees are known to like to nest in.
Mhm.
And you've got a shrub layer that probably, a number of them can provide nectar and pollen so that they can reproduce. That almost seems to me I can understand why this is taking place. Am I far off?
I think that's probably right. And I have to say probably because it's all correlative, right? And also because we didn't see as strong of a relationship as I would have liked to between the bees in our study and the flowering plants. I think that might be because, by the time we were actually out there looking at flowers, I think a lot of those shrubs had actually passed their peak bloom. So a
Ah,
lot of them are really early flowering. And we were out there maybe just a couple weeks too late in some cases where the bees are probably still there and we're still seeing
yeah.
those bees. But that big pulse of like, I don't know if you've ever seen like a huge swath of ceanothus all blooming at once. It's quite impressive. But
Yeah.
so we saw for that group a pretty strong correlation between like flowering species richness, the number of different flowering species in their abundance, but not so much like just the amount of flowering. And so it's kind of like, all right, I think we know what's going on, but it's not exactly clear. There might have also, I think we weren't counting wind pollinated species as
Hmm.
part of our study when we were counting flowers, but I think that may have been a mistake. As I said, a lot of the broadleaf plants are sort of oaks. So whether that's Canaan live oak, which is a Quercus and oak species, or tan oak, which is a close oak relative, in I think they might be providing an important source of pollen as well that we kind of missed.
Hmm.
Some studies in the eastern U.S. have gone up into the canopy of broadleaf forests and shown that there's a whole bee community up there that we often miss by sampling on the forest floor, and they're using all of these resources from flowering trees. And so I think future studies should definitely be looking at I guess, these wind pollinated broadleaf trees as well when they're thinking about floral resources.
I suppose this, just to tie a bow on this, it does raise questions about forest management, I imagine.
Mhm. Yeah.
It's surprising, maybe one surprise is that forest management is not completely incompatible with bee diversity, that this disturbance has, mimics natural disturbances in some ways, but in some ways not. What's the sort of broader takeaway from this study?
Yeah, I think for me, there are two big ones. One is that the when we're thinking about across forest landscapes, when we're managing at really broad scales, which we often do in the era of data and remote sensing, I think it's important that we think about different types of early sterile forests differently, that we don't consider them all equal. And I think intellectually people do know that there's a big difference between a burned forest and a clear-cut forest. And I think that we've shown that with our bee data. But I think it's kind of important that when we're, thinking about the successional stages and that kind of shifting mosaic of forest ages across the landscape, that we keep in our mind that not all disturbance is the same. I think at a finer scale, when we're thinking about, what can we do in a forest harvest to better support bees? I think this research suggests, and again, it's not an experiment. We didn't test this one specific thing, but I think our research suggests that more dead wood would be helpful for supporting some of these bee species. Particularly this solitary cavity nesting or above ground nesting group that we found fewer of in clear cuts. One sort of caveat there or avenue for future research that I think is really interesting is that, fire also tends to attract a lot of wood-boring beetles, right? So a lot of buprestids, for example, are known to be attracted to smoke for miles around. And there was a really cool study in California where they compared, I think it was wood-boring beetle activity after fire to wood-boring beetle activity after a bark beetle outbreak. So also, another disturbance that killed trees,
Yeah,
but there was a lot more wood-boring beetle activity
really.
after fire. And so what I'm getting at is that even if we add dead wood to a clear cut, it's possible that, there aren't the cavities in that dead wood that these bees need. I'm totally speculating at this point, but
No,
yeah,
I imagine that that's part of it is the beetles are essential for creating the cavities that those cavity nesting bees are going to get into. And if they're not, if you just have the dead wood and it's intact, that's a different thing. Oh, that's
right.
fascinating. It's an interesting question.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of people think about woodpeckers, right? These like primary cavity nesters that are creating nesting habitat for secondary cavity nesting species. So similar relationship to that. We did have a Xylocopa, a carpenter bee,
Hmm.
and that species creates its own, they excavate their own nests in sound wood, but a lot of the species in this group were Osmia and a couple of other genera that use existing cavities.
This is an amazing study. Congratulations on the publication of the paper. For those, if you're interested, we'll have it linked for you to look at in the show notes. Thank you again for joining us this week on PolliNation.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Andoni. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much for listening. Show notes with links from each episode are available at the website pollinationpodcast.oregonstate.edu. I also love hearing from you, and there's a form at the website where you can pop in and say hello and give me feedback. If you want to support the show, remember to leave a rating on iTunes, Spotify, or whatever podcast mothership you use. And finally, if you have the means and you want to help support my lab's effort to document bee biodiversity in Oregon, visit OregonBeeAtlas.org and follow down to the donate button where you can make a tax-deductible donation to the Jerry and Judith Paul Native Pollinator Endowment. Every little bit helps. See you next episode.